22 planes, grounded, and the only man who can fix them is the one they fired 6 months ago, Midnight, an unknown number. The CEO who fired him is calling him back.
Yes, this is Daniel.
11 years of experience just walked back through that door, and everyone in that hangar knows exactly what it means. One loose wire, one overlooked connection, the difference between grounded and airborne. By sunrise, 18 planes were flying again, and the man they fired just saved the airline that let him go.
The hangar lights at Skybridge Airlines never really went off. Even at 3 in the morning, they buzzed pale and cold over row after row of grounded aircraft, throwing long shadows across the concrete like ribs on a corpse. 22 planes sat there that night, wings dark, engines silent, cockpits empty. 22 planes that were supposed to be in the sky by sunrise, carrying thousands of passengers to cities across the country. Instead, they were parked in the maintenance yard like broken toys, and nobody could explain why. If you had told anyone at Skybridge a year earlier that the answer to the biggest crisis in the airline's history would come from a man they had just fired, they would have laughed. But sometimes the people companies throw away are the only ones who ever really understood how the whole machine worked in the first place. Before you find out what happened in that hangar, hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one deserve to be seen by more people, and there is a lot more coming. Now let's go back to where it all began. His name was Daniel Reyes, and for 11 years he had been one of the best aircraft maintenance technicians Skybridge Airlines had ever employed. He was 38 years old, with calloused hands, tired eyes, and a quiet, steady way of speaking that made people trust him even when he was delivering bad news. He was also a single father. His wife had passed away 4 years earlier, after a long illness, leaving him alone to raise his 8-year-old daughter, Mia, a bright, curious girl, with her mother's stubborn optimism and her father's careful, watchful eyes. Daniel's life ran on a tight, exhausting schedule. Mornings began at 5, packing Mia's lunch, braiding her hair, because he had finally learned how after years of clumsy attempts, and dropping her at school, before racing across the city to the airport hangar, where he spent 10 hours crawling through the guts of jet engines, checking hydraulic lines, and signing off on inspections that kept hundreds of lives safe every single day. He rarely complained. He rarely asked for anything. He simply worked, because working was the only way he knew to keep his daughter fed, clothed, and safe in a world that had already taken her mother from her. He loved his job in a way that went beyond a paycheck. To Daniel, an aircraft was not just metal and wiring. It was a promise that everyone who boarded that plane would land again, safely, back in the arms of the people waiting for them. He had built his entire identity around keeping that promise. One bolt, one gauge, one inspection at a time. But airlines are businesses, and businesses do not always value promises the way the people who keep them do. 6 months before that night in the hangar, Skybridge Airlines brought in a new operations director named Marcus Webb. Marcus had an MBA, a talent for spreadsheets, and almost no patience for anything he could not quantify. He looked at the maintenance department and saw only cost. He saw overtime hours, aging technicians, and slow, methodical inspection processes that, in his mind, could be replaced by newer, cheaper labor and faster software-driven diagnostics. He did not see the decades of hard-won expertise sitting in men and women like Daniel Reyes. He saw numbers on a page, and the numbers told him to cut. Daniel became one of the first names on Marcus's list, not because his work was poor, but because his salary, built on over a decade of seniority and specialized certifications, was higher than a newly hired technician's would be. When the termination meeting happened, it lasted less than 10 minutes. Marcus barely looked up from his laptop as he explained that the company was restructuring, that positions were being consolidated, and that Daniel's role was, unfortunately, one of them. Daniel sat there in stunned silence. 11 years, thousands of inspections, countless nights spent finishing a job long after his shift technically ended because something did not feel quite right, and he refused to sign off until it did. None of it seemed to matter in that small, sterile office with its humming fluorescent lights. "Is there anything I did wrong?" Daniel finally asked, his voice steady, even though his hands were not. Marcus did not even flinch. "It's not personal, it's business." Daniel walked out of that building, carrying a cardboard box with 11 years of his life in it. A coffee mug Mia had painted for him, a photo of her first day of school, a worn leather logbook filled with his own careful handwriting. He sat in his car in the employee parking lot for nearly 20 minutes before he could bring himself to drive home, because he did not know how he was going to tell his daughter that things were about to get harder. That night, he told Mia the truth, because he had promised her mother he never would lie to her. He explained, in simple words a child could understand, that his job had ended, that money would be tight for a while, but that they would figure it out together, the way they always had. Mia, in the way that only children can, simply hugged him and said, "You always fix things, Dad. You'll fix this too." He held on to those words tighter than he wanted to admit. In the quiet hours after Mia fell asleep, Daniel sometimes allowed himself to think about his wife, Sarah. She had been a nurse, the kind of person who came home from 12-hour shifts and still had enough patience left over to help Mia with a puzzle, or listen to Daniel talk through a difficult repair he could not stop turning over in his mind. When she got sick, Daniel had watched her fight through more surgeries and treatments than he ever expected a person to endure, and when she finally lost that fight, he had made her a quiet promise at her bedside that Mia would never doubt, not for a single day, that she was loved, supported, and safe. Losing his job did not just threaten his ability to pay rent, it threatened his ability to keep that promise, and that fear sat heavier on him than any spreadsheet-driven layoff notice ever could. For weeks, Daniel searched for work. He sent out resumes to every airline and maintenance contractor within 100 miles. He got polite rejections, or worse, silence. The aviation maintenance world was smaller than people realized, and word travels fast. Some hiring managers hesitated simply because he had been let go from Skybridge, assuming there must have been a reason, even though there wasn't one beyond cost-cutting on a spreadsheet. Daniel picked up odd jobs where he could, fixing cars for neighbors, doing small repair work, anything to keep the lights on, and Mia fed. Meanwhile, at Skybridge, the cracks that Marcus Webb's cost-cutting had created were beginning to show, though almost no one connected the dots at first. The replacement technicians Marcus hired were competent on paper, certified, trained, capable of following checklists. But aviation maintenance is not only about following checklists, it is about intuition, built from thousands of hours spent inside the machine. An ear that can hear the difference between a normal engine hum and one that is a half step away from trouble. A hand that knows exactly how much torque a fitting needs before it becomes dangerous, rather than secure. That kind of knowledge cannot be taught in a 6-week onboarding program. It has to be lived. Small problems began appearing. A hydraulic line here, replaced but not seated quite right. A sensor calibration there, technically within tolerance, but not optimized the way Daniel would have insisted on. Individually, none of these issues were catastrophic. But aviation safety inspectors do not think individually. They think in patterns. And patterns are exactly what began to worry the Federal Aviation Administration liaison assigned to Skybridge's fleet. Then came the storm. Literally and figuratively. A severe weather system rolled through the region, grounding flights for nearly 2 full days. When the storm passed, and Skybridge scrambled to get its fleet back into rotation, the newly hired maintenance team, already stretched thin and unfamiliar with the specific quirks of Skybridge aging aircraft models, began finding irregularities during the mandatory post-storm inspections. A fuel valve here that would not properly recalibrate. An avionics warning light there that would not clear despite repeated resets. What should have been a routine return-to-service process turned into chaos. By the next morning, 22 aircraft, nearly a third of Skybridge's entire operational fleet, sat grounded in the maintenance yard, unable to pass inspection. Flights were canceled by the dozens. News vans began parking outside the airport. Passengers slept on terminal floors, furious and confused. Social media filled with videos of stranded families, delayed honeymoons, missed funerals, and one particularly viral clip of a toddler crying next to a cancellation board that had turned almost entirely red. Inside the terminal, the human cost of 22 grounded aircraft became painfully visible. An elderly couple sat wrapped in airport blankets near their gate, their 40th anniversary cruise slipping further away with every hour of delay. A young man in a rumpled suit paced near a charging station, missing the biggest job interview of his career, and unable to reach anyone to explain why. A mother traveling alone, with 3 children under the age of 6, tried to keep them entertained, with granola bars and a phone at 11% battery, apologizing to strangers for the noise, while quietly wondering how she was going to make it through the night. None of them knew the names Marcus Webb or Daniel Reyes. They only knew that their lives had been put on hold by decisions made in offices they would never see, and that frustration curdled quickly into anger directed at gate agents who had no power to fix any of it. Every hour those planes sat grounded cost the airline staggering amounts of money. But worse than the money was the damage to Skybridge's reputation, a reputation built over 3 decades of reliability that was unraveling in real time on live television. The CEO of Skybridge Airlines, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Elena Cross, had built her career on precisely this kind of crisis management. She had taken over the company 8 years earlier and steered it through fuel price shocks, a pandemic-era collapse in air travel, and a merger that could have destroyed the company if handled poorly. She was known throughout the industry as someone who did not panic, who asked the right questions, and who never, ever accepted an easy answer when a real one was available. When she arrived at the hangar that morning, still in the dark blue blazer she had worn to a board meeting the night before, she found chaos. Maintenance crews moved frantically between aircraft, clipboards in hand, radios crackling with conflicting updates. Marcus Webb stood near the hangar entrance, sweating through his shirt, insisting to anyone who would listen that the problems were unrelated, isolated incidents, nothing systemic. Elena did not believe him for a second. 22 planes do not fail inspection on the same morning by coincidence, she said, her voice cutting through the noise. Something changed. I want to know what. For the rest of that day, and deep into the night, Elena walked the hangar floor herself, something CEOs rarely do, listening to technicians, engineers, and inspectors. She heard fragments of frustration everywhere she turned. A young technician admitted, quietly and nervously, that he had never actually worked on this particular model's fuel valve system before being hired 6 months earlier. An inspector mentioned, almost in passing, that the old guy who used to run night inspections would have caught this in 10 minutes. Easy. Elena asked which old guy. Nobody wanted to answer directly, aware that the subject was sensitive after the layoffs, until finally, one senior mechanic, an older man named Tobias, who had survived the cuts by sheer seniority, spoke up. Daniel Reyes, Tobias said. Best mechanic this hangar ever had. Marcus let him go 6 months back to save on payroll. Man could diagnose a plane by the sound of its engine spooling up. We haven't been the same since he left, and I think everybody here knows it. They just don't want to say it out loud. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach, the particular chill of realizing a decision made far above her, or at least far outside her direct oversight, might now be the reason her airline was collapsing in front of the entire country. Get me his number, she said. It was nearly midnight when Daniel's phone rang. He was sitting at his small kitchen table, correcting Mia's spelling homework by lamplight after finally getting her to sleep, when an unfamiliar number lit up his screen. He almost let it go to voicemail. Late-night calls rarely brought good news anymore. "Mr. Reyes," the voice on the other end said. "My name is Elena Cross. I'm the CEO of Skybridge Airlines. I know this is late, and I know how you left the company. And I understand if you want to hang up right now. But I have 22 grounded aircraft, thousands of stranded passengers, and a maintenance team that is completely out of its depth. I need someone who actually understands these planes. I was told that person is you." Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, his eyes drifting to the cardboard box still sitting, unpacked, in the corner of his living room. Part of him wanted to say no. Part of him wanted to remind her exactly how Skybridge had discarded him after 11 loyal years, tossed aside over a line item in a spreadsheet. But another part of him, the part that had built his entire identity around the promise that every passenger deserved to land safely, simply could not say no to 22 planes and the people who needed them fixed. "Give me 20 minutes, Daniel said. He called his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who had watched Mia countless times before, apologized for the late hour, and asked if she could come sit with his sleeping daughter. Then he grabbed his old leather tool bag, the one Skybridge had let him keep out of what he now realized was either guilt or indifference, and drove through empty streets toward the hangar that had once been the center of his entire life. When Daniel walked back through those hangar doors, still wearing his patched jacket instead of a company uniform, the reaction was immediate. Technicians who had worked alongside him for years straightened up, some smiling with relief, some looking almost ashamed that it had taken a crisis to bring him back. Marcus Webb, standing near the coffee station, went pale. Elena Cross walked directly toward him, extending her hand. "Mr. Reyes, thank you for coming. Call me Daniel," he said quietly, shaking her hand. "Where do you want me to start?" For the next 14 hours, Daniel moved through that hangar like a man who had never left it. He listened to engines the way other people listen to music, catching irregularities in pitch and rhythm that no diagnostic software had flagged. He found a batch of improperly calibrated fuel sensors, traced back to a rushed training session the new hires had received. He identified a recurring hydraulic seating issue caused by a supplier switch Marcus had approved to cut costs, a switch that used parts technically within specification, but subtly incompatible with the airline's older aircraft models. One by one, he walked newer technicians through corrections, patiently, without a hint of resentment, explaining not just what to fix, but why it mattered, the exact kind of teaching that no manual could replace. At one point, a young technician named Priya, barely 8 months into her first aviation job, froze in front of an avionics panel that refused to clear a persistent warning light no matter how many times she reset it. She was close to tears, convinced she was about to be blamed for a mistake that might ground yet another aircraft. Daniel crouched beside her, without a hint of judgment in his voice, tracing the wiring harness with a flashlight until he found a loose ground connection hidden behind a bundle of cables that no checklist had told her to inspect. "This isn't your fault," he told her quietly. "Nobody taught you to look here, because nobody who trained you had ever been burned by it before. Now you have, and you'll never miss it again." Priya would later tell co-workers that those 30 seconds taught her more about being a real technician than her entire 6-week onboarding program combined. By late afternoon, planes began rolling out of the hangar and back toward the runway, cleared, safe, ready to fly. 18 of the 22 aircraft were cleared within that first day. The remaining 4 needed parts that had to be specially ordered. But Daniel personally signed off on temporary safety protocols that allowed Skybridge to responsibly reroute those specific routes without risking passenger safety, buying the company crucial time. Elena watched from the hangar office window for most of that day, occasionally walking the floor to check progress, always staying just far enough away to let Daniel work without feeling watched. but close enough to see everything. She saw a man who could have easily gloated, who could have made the newer technicians feel small for their mistakes, who could have used this moment as leverage to demand whatever he wanted from a company that clearly needed him, desperately. Instead, she saw someone who simply fixed problems and quietly taught people how to avoid them next time, because that was who Daniel Reyes actually was, underneath everything. Late that night, once the immediate crisis had stabilized and most of the fleet was cleared for the next morning's flights, Elena found Daniel alone in the hangar, sitting on an overturned equipment crate, drinking lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, his tool bag finally closed beside him. "Can I ask you something?" she said, sitting down on the crate beside him, without waiting for permission. Daniel nodded, too tired to do much else. "Why did you come back? After everything, after how this company let you go, why show up at midnight to save us?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, turning the paper cup slowly in his hands. "Because somewhere on one of those 22 planes tomorrow morning is going to be a father, flying home to his kid's birthday party. A mother flying to see her own mother in the hospital before it's too late. A kid flying alone to visit her dad for the summer, scared and excited at the same time. They don't know my name. They never will. But they deserve to land safely, no matter what happened between me and this company." That part was never about Marcus, or budgets, or how I was treated. It was always about them. Elena sat with that answer for a long time before speaking again. "I'm going to be honest with you, Daniel. I didn't know about your termination specifics until tonight, when Tobias told me. I trusted my operations director to handle staffing decisions responsibly, and I failed to notice when responsible cost management turned into reckless cost-cutting that put people at risk. That's on me, as much as it is on him." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen over the runway, Elena called an emergency meeting with the full executive board. She laid out, in blunt, unflinching detail, exactly how Marcus Webb's cost-cutting decisions had gutted the institutional knowledge holding the airline's maintenance safety together, and how the near-catastrophic grounding of 22 aircraft had been directly caused by that decision. Marcus tried to argue, insisting that his cost projections had been sound, that no reasonable model could have predicted the grounding, that he was being made a scapegoat for something no one could have foreseen. Elena listened to his entire defense without interrupting, then asked him a single question. "Did you ever once set foot in that hangar and ask the technicians on the floor what they thought before you made these cuts?" Marcus had no answer, because the truth was that he never had. He had made every decision from behind a desk, trusting numbers over the people those numbers were supposed to represent. Marcus was terminated within the hour, his own box of belongings carried out through the same lobby where Daniel had once carried his. Then Elena did something the board did not expect. She did not simply offer Daniel his old position back. She created an entirely new role for him: Director of Maintenance Standards, overseeing training, safety protocols, and technician development across the airline's entire fleet, with full authority to redesign the onboarding process so that no future technician would ever be thrown into critical work without the mentorship that institutional knowledge like his provided. The salary came with a number attached that made Daniel sit back in his chair when he first saw the offer letter. But more than the money, it came with something he had quietly given up hoping for: recognition that his expertise was not a cost to be trimmed, but the very foundation the entire operation depended on. When Daniel told Mia that evening, sitting at their small kitchen table with the offer letter between them, she looked at him with the same steady, trusting eyes her mother once had. "I told you," she said simply. "You always fix things." Daniel signed the offer letter that same night, right there at the kitchen table, using the same pen he used to help Mia with her homework. And for a moment, he let himself imagine his wife somewhere nearby, silently proud that the promise he made at her bedside had held after all, even through the hardest year either of them could have imagined. Tobias, the senior mechanic who had first spoken Daniel's name to Elena that morning, found him near the tool crib a few days later, looking almost embarrassed as he shuffled his feet before speaking. "I should have said something sooner," Tobias admitted. "When they let you go, half of us knew it was a mistake. We just didn't think anyone up top would listen if we said it out loud." Daniel just clapped him on the shoulder and told him there was nothing to apologize for, that showing up when it mattered most was worth more than any speech could have been. It was a small exchange, but it mattered to both of them, a quiet acknowledgement that loyalty between people on the hangar floor had never actually disappeared, even when the company above them had briefly forgotten how to value it. Word of what happened at Skybridge spread quickly through the industry, and then, thanks to a passenger who had filmed part of the chaotic grounding and later posted an update about the resolution through social media as well, people were moved not just by the story of a crisis averted, but by the deeper truth underneath it, that the people companies too often treat as replaceable line items are frequently the very people holding everything together, quietly, without recognition, until the moment they are needed most. Skybridge Airlines used the incident as a turning point. Elena Cross implemented sweeping changes to how the company valued and retained experienced staff, publicly committing to protecting institutional knowledge rather than discarding it for short-term savings. Daniel became an unlikely, reluctant public face of that shift, uncomfortable with attention but willing to speak, briefly and humbly, when reporters asked him about that long night in the hangar. He never framed himself as a hero. He always redirected the conversation back to the technicians he trained, the safety systems he rebuilt, and, most of all, back to his daughter, who he credited with reminding him, on the hardest night of that entire ordeal, of exactly who he was and what mattered most. Months later, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, Daniel stood on the observation deck at the airport, with Mia beside him, watching a Skybridge aircraft lift smoothly off the runway and climb into a clear blue sky. Somewhere inside that plane were people flying home, flying toward reunions, toward hospital bedsides, toward birthday parties, and long-awaited homecomings, none of them aware of the man standing on the ground below, who had quietly made sure they would land safely. Mia slipped her small hand into his. "Do you miss being fired?" she asked, with the blunt honesty only a child can manage. Daniel laughed, a real, easy laugh, the kind he had not allowed himself in months. "No," he said, "but I'm grateful for what it taught me. Sometimes you have to lose everything you built to find out what it was really worth, and who actually needed it." They stood there together a while longer, father and daughter, watching planes rise one after another into the open sky, each one carrying a promise that a tired, quietly determined man had spent his entire career keeping. Mia leaned her head against his arm and asked if they could come back next Saturday too, and Daniel promised her they would, because for the first time in a long while, he had a schedule steady enough and a paycheck secure enough to keep a promise that small and that important. It was not a grand gesture or a dramatic reunion. It was simply two people who had survived a hard season together, standing in the sun, a little more certain than before that they would be all right. And somewhere in a boardroom across the city, Elena Cross kept a single framed photo on her office wall from that chaotic week. 22 aircraft lined up in the hangar at dawn, finally cleared for flight. It was not a photo of triumph or crisis. It was a reminder, she told visitors who asked about it, that the strength of any company is never really found in its spreadsheets or its cost projections. It is found in the people who show up at midnight, without being asked twice, simply because somewhere out there, someone is counting on them to get home safe. Visitors who noticed the photo often assumed it commemorated a company milestone, or an anniversary worth celebrating. Elena rarely corrected that assumption out loud, but she kept a small brass plate beneath the frame, engraved with a single line, "For the ones who show up anyway." She never explained further, because the people who understood it did not need the explanation, and the people who did not understand it yet, were exactly the ones she hoped would learn its meaning eventually. The same way she had, standing in that hangar at 3 in the morning, with 22 grounded planes, and one quietly determined man who refused to let them stay that way. If this story moved you, that single dad's story is proof that quiet loyalty and real skill always find their way back into the light eventually. Let us know in the comments what part of Daniel's story hit you the hardest, and subscribe for more stories like this one every week.